There's a toll booth on the road to nowhere, and almost everyone pays it without ever noticing. It's the cost of staying exactly where you are, and it never shows up as a single dramatic charge. It shows up quietly, year after year, in the form of a life that stayed roughly the same size, while the version of you capable of something larger simply never got built. It's worth being precise about why this particular toll is so easy to pay without noticing. Unlike most costs, it never arrives with a receipt. There's no specific moment where a bill gets presented for the risk not taken, the conversation not had, the attempt not made. Instead, the cost simply accumulates in the shape of a life that's slightly smaller than it could have been, year after year, in ways that are genuinely difficult to point to directly, precisely because nothing dramatic ever actually happened to mark the loss. Most people only calculate the cost of failure. They imagine trying something, falling short, and tally up the embarrassment, the wasted effort, the money lost. What almost nobody calculates is the cost of the version of themselves that never got to exist because the attempt never happened at all. That second cost is invisible, which is exactly why it's so easy to underestimate and so easy to keep paying indefinitely without ever noticing the total. Today we're going to walk through what genuine, intelligent risk-taking actually looks like, why it has almost nothing in common with recklessness, and why the safest feeling choice is so often, over a long enough timeline, the most expensive one available. This is a longer session because the underlying distinction between courage and recklessness gets confused constantly, and a shallow treatment of it tends to either scare people away from any risk at all, or push them toward reckless decisions dressed up as bravery. Neither outcome is useful. What we're building toward instead is a genuinely usable framework for telling the two apart, and for taking the kind of risk that actually moves a life forward rather than simply gambling with it. Here's the first thing worth understanding. Certainty is not a condition you wait for. It's a myth you can wait for indefinitely because it never actually arrives. Most meaningful opportunities in life come wrapped in some amount of genuine uncertainty. Nobody can hand you a guarantee before you start a business, before you have a difficult conversation, before you apply for something you're not sure you're qualified for. The uncertainty isn't a sign the opportunity is wrong. It's simply an inherent feature of anything that hasn't happened yet. And anyone waiting for that uncertainty to fully resolve before acting is functionally waiting forever. This is worth sitting with directly, because it changes the actual question you should be asking. The useful question was, never am I certain this will work. Nobody ever in the history of meaningful risk has been fully certain before taking it. The more useful question is, have I prepared enough that this uncertainty is worth stepping into? That's a completely different question. And it's one you can actually answer, unlike the first one, which has no honest answer available at all. There's a specific pattern worth watching for in yourself here. Notice the language you use internally when you're avoiding something. I just need a bit more information first. I'll decide once I know more. Sometimes that's genuinely true and genuinely wise. But often it's simply certainty seeking, dressed up as due diligence, a way of postponing indefinitely while feeling responsible about it. The honest test is asking whether the additional information you're waiting for is actually obtainable before acting, or whether it's the kind of information that can only ever arrive after you've already taken the step. Here's the second thing worth understanding. Fear is a passenger in the car, not the driver, and the sooner you separate those two roles, the more clearly you can actually see the road. Fear rarely goes away before action. It tends to sit quietly in the passenger seat the entire drive, occasionally speaking up, occasionally getting loud, but never actually holding the wheel unless you hand it over. The mistake most people make is treating fear's presence as a stop sign, as though its voice in the car means the trip itself is unsafe. Fear's presence in the car was never the signal to stop. It was simply confirmation that the destination actually matters to you. Think about anything you've ever genuinely cared about attempting. The fear showing up wasn't a malfunction. It was proportional to how much the outcome actually mattered to you. Something you don't care about rarely produces any fear at all, precisely because there's nothing at stake. The presence of fear, properly understood, is closer to a signal of significance than a signal of danger. This reframe is genuinely useful in the moment fear shows up, not just as an abstract idea. The next time a specific fear surfaces around something you're considering, try asking it directly what it's actually protecting you from, rather than simply obeying it by default. Often the honest answer is embarrassment, or the discomfort of being seen trying and possibly failing, rather than any genuine physical danger. Naming that specifically tends to loosen fear's grip considerably more than simply trying to will it away through sheer determination. Here's the third thing worth understanding, and it's the one people avoid thinking about the most. There's a specific asymmetry between the pain of failing and the pain of never trying, and almost nobody weighs them accurately in the moment. Failure, uncomfortable as it is, tends to come with a lesson attached. It's specific. It points at something. It teaches you what didn't work, what to adjust, what to try differently next time. That specificity is what makes failure survivable, and often, over time, genuinely useful. Regret works entirely differently. It doesn't teach anything because there's no actual data attached to a road never taken. It simply lingers, vague and unresolved, asking an unanswerable question indefinitely without ever offering the relief of an actual lesson learned. This is why people who have taken meaningful risks and failed tend to describe the experience, in hindsight, as valuable, even when it was genuinely painful at the time. And it's why people who avoided the risk entirely tend to describe the absence, years later, not as relief, but as a specific, nagging kind of unfinished business that never quite resolves on its own. It's worth being honest that this asymmetry isn't always obvious in the moment a decision is actually being made. In the moment, the pain of a possible failure feels vivid, specific, and immediate, while the pain of a possible future regret feels distant, abstract, and easy to discount. This is exactly why so many decisions get made in favor of avoiding the vivid, immediate discomfort, even when the quieter, distant cost turns out later to have been considerably larger. Recognizing this bias in advance, before the decision moment actually arrives, makes it somewhat easier to weigh the two accurately rather than defaulting to whichever pain feels loudest right now. One useful exercise for correcting this bias in the moment. Imagine yourself explaining the decision 5 years from now to someone you respect. Picture both versions, the one where you took the risk and it didn't work out, and the one where you avoided it entirely. Notice which version, described honestly 5 years later, actually sounds like the more difficult story to tell. For most genuinely meaningful risks, the avoided version, described honestly, tends to sound considerably worse in hindsight than the attempted and failed version does, even though in the immediate moment of decision, the opposite usually feels true. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding. Confidence is not a prerequisite for action. It's a byproduct manufactured by action, arriving considerably after the fact, not before it. This is worth stating even more directly, because the misunderstanding around it is so persistent. Almost every piece of casual advice about building confidence implicitly assumes it can be built in isolation through visualization, affirmation, or simply thinking positively enough about an outcome. None of that reliably produces the kind of confidence that actually holds up under real pressure. The confidence that holds up is specifically the kind built through direct evidence of having survived something uncomfortable before, and that evidence only exists after the uncomfortable thing has actually happened, not before. Most people are waiting to feel ready before they begin, and that wait tends to be indefinite because the feeling of readiness was never actually going to arrive independently of the action itself. Confidence gets built the same way calluses get built, through repeated, direct contact with something uncomfortable, not through advanced preparation alone, however thorough that preparation might be. This means the entire order most people assume is backwards. They imagine, feel confident, then act. The actual sequence, observable in nearly anyone who has built genuine confidence in any domain, runs the other direction. Act, survive it, and let the confidence accumulate afterward, as evidence that you can, in fact, survive it. There is no shortcut available that skips the acting part. There's a useful way to test which order you're actually operating under. Ask whether you're currently waiting to feel a certain way before starting something, or whether you've already started and are simply building the feeling as you go. Most genuine progress happens in the second mode, uncomfortable and often quietly anxious the entire way through, rather than the first mode, which tends to involve an indefinite wait for a feeling that was never actually going to show up first. Here's the fifth thing worth understanding, and it's the distinction that separates genuine courage from simple recklessness, which people confuse constantly. Intelligent risk is not the absence of preparation. It's preparation followed by a decision to act, despite the preparation never being complete. This confusion between courage and recklessness is worth naming directly, because it causes real damage in both directions. Some people, having watched someone act recklessly and get hurt, conclude that all risk is dangerous and retreat entirely into permanent caution. Others, wanting to appear bold, skip preparation entirely and mistake the resulting gamble for courage, when it's actually closer to a coin flip dressed up in confident language. Neither response is accurate, and both miss the actual distinction that matters, which has nothing to do with how much risk is involved, and everything to do with how much genuine preparation came before it. Recklessness skips the preparation entirely and calls the resulting gamble bravery. Genuine courage does the opposite. It prepares seriously, studies the terrain, builds relevant skill, and then at some point makes a deliberate decision to step forward anyway, understanding that no amount of additional preparation will ever fully eliminate the uncertainty involved. The difference isn't the presence of risk. Both paths involve risk. The difference is whether any real preparation happened before the leap. This distinction matters because it changes what being ready actually means. Being ready was never about eliminating all uncertainty before acting, since that's an impossible standard nobody has ever met. Being ready means having done the reasonable available preparation and then trusting that preparation enough to act while genuine uncertainty still remains, because it always will. A practical way to check whether a given risk is intelligent or reckless. Ask whether you could clearly explain to someone whose judgment you respect exactly what preparation you've actually done and exactly what specific gap remains that the action itself would help close. If you can answer both parts specifically, you're likely looking at intelligent risk. If the honest answer to the preparation question is essentially nothing, that's a meaningful signal worth taking seriously, not a detail to brush past on the way to a decision you've already emotionally committed to. Here's the sixth thing worth understanding. The size of the first step matters far less than most people assume. What matters is the direction repeated consistently, not the size of any single move. There's a common trap where people wait for a large, dramatic opportunity to demonstrate their courage, while ignoring the small, unglamorous opportunity sitting directly in front of them every single day. But courage, like most skills, tends to be built through repetition at a manageable scale, not through a single overwhelming leap that most people were never actually prepared to survive anyway. A small, consistent pattern of choosing the slightly uncomfortable option over the comfortable one, repeated across many ordinary days, tends to produce a considerably more durable form of courage than waiting years for one enormous, singular moment. By the time that enormous moment does arrive, if it ever does, the person who's been practicing on smaller stakes all along is simply far better prepared to actually meet it. There's a specific reason small, repeated practice outperforms waiting for one large moment. Courage, like most capacities, responds to repetition more reliably than to intensity. A single overwhelming attempt, without any prior practice at a smaller scale, carries a much higher chance of producing an experience so uncomfortable that it discourages any further attempts at all. Smaller, repeated practice builds the same underlying capacity more gradually and considerably more sustainably, precisely because each individual step is small enough to survive and learn from rather than being potentially overwhelming enough to end the entire pattern after just one try. And here's the seventh and final truth worth naming, closely tied to everything above. The comfort zone was never designed to be a permanent residence. It was designed as a staging area, useful for recovery and preparation, but never meant to be lived in indefinitely. There's real value in comfort. Rest matters. Recovery matters. Nobody benefits from a state of constant, unrelenting discomfort, and anyone suggesting otherwise is overselling the value of struggle for its own sake. But there's a meaningful difference between comfort used as a genuine staging area, a place to rest and prepare before the next step, and comfort used as a permanent hiding place from any further growth at all. The test for telling these two apart is relatively simple. Genuine rest, used as a staging area, eventually points back outward, toward the next attempt, once genuine recovery has actually occurred. Comfort used as a permanent hiding place tends to point nowhere at all, extending indefinitely, with no actual return to forward motion ever really planned or intended. There's an eighth truth worth adding here, and it concerns something that quietly sabotages a lot of otherwise well-intentioned risk-taking. The tendency to evaluate a decision purely by its outcome, rather than by the quality of the decision itself given what was actually knowable at the time it was made. This distinction matters enormously because a genuinely well-prepared, thoughtfully taken risk can still fail, simply due to factors that were never actually predictable in advance. And a genuinely careless, poorly prepared risk can still succeed purely through good fortune. Judging the decision only by whether it happened to work out produces a distorted, unreliable feedback loop, one that can accidentally punish good decision-making that had bad luck and accidentally reward reckless decision-making that got lucky. The more useful evaluation asks a different question entirely. Given what was actually known and knowable at the time, was this a reasonable, well-prepared decision to make? If the honest answer is yes, the outcome, whatever it turned out to be, doesn't retroactively make the decision itself wrong. Separating decision quality from outcome quality is one of the more advanced skills in this entire subject. And it's precisely what allows someone to keep taking intelligent risks, even after an occasional one doesn't work out, rather than becoming permanently risk-averse after a single unlucky result. This skill matters most precisely in the aftermath of a genuine failure, when the temptation to conclude, "I should never have tried that," is strongest and least reliable. A useful practice in that moment. Write down, honestly, what you actually knew at the time you made the decision, separate from what you know now after the outcome has already happened. Comparing the two often reveals that the original decision was considerably more reasonable, given the information genuinely available at the time, than it feels in hindsight once the outcome has colored the entire memory of the decision that led to it. And there's a ninth truth worth naming before we bring everything together, closely related to the eighth. The people around you, more than almost any other factor, quietly shape how much genuine risk feels available to you at all. Spend enough time around people who treat any deviation from the safe, predictable path as alarming or foolish, and that framing tends to seep into your own internal sense of what's reasonable, even if you never consciously adopt their specific opinions. Spend time instead around people who've taken thoughtful, prepared risks themselves, and a very different sense of what's normal and available tends to take hold instead, often without any direct conversation about it ever needing to happen. This doesn't mean surrounding yourself only with people who encourage every risk indiscriminately, which would simply replace one distortion with another. It means being aware that your own internal calibration of what counts as reasonable risk is being shaped constantly and mostly invisibly by the environment you're immersed in, and that seeking out people who've actually walked a similar uncertain path before you can recalibrate that sense considerably faster than trying to figure it out entirely alone. A practical way to apply this: identify one person, even someone you don't know personally, who has taken a version of the risk you're currently considering, and study specifically how they approach the preparation phase, not just the outcome they eventually achieved. Most public accounts of someone else's risk focus heavily on the dramatic result and skip almost entirely over the unglamorous preparation that came before it, which is precisely the part most useful to actually learn from. Seeking out that missing piece deliberately tends to make an unfamiliar risk feel considerably more approachable than simply admiring the polished outcome from a distance. So let's bring these 9 truths together, because on their own they're interesting observations, but together they form something considerably more useful. Certainty was never coming, so stop waiting for it and start asking whether your preparation is sufficient instead. Fear is a passenger, not a driver, and its presence signals significance, not danger. Failure teaches, regret simply lingers without ever resolving. Confidence is manufactured by action, not felt in advance of it. Genuine courage is preparation followed by action, despite remaining uncertainty, which is an entirely different thing from recklessness. The size of the first step matters far less than the direction, repeated consistently. The comfort zone was always meant to be a staging area, not a permanent residence. Judge your decisions by their quality given what was knowable at the time, not simply by how they happened to turn out. And pay attention to who's shaping your sense of what counts as reasonable risk in the first place. None of these 9 truths require you to become fearless, because becoming fearless was never actually the goal, and it isn't realistically available to anyone, regardless of how accomplished they eventually become. What's actually required is considerably smaller and considerably more achievable, a willingness to act while the fear is still present, informed by real preparation, aimed at a direction you've actually chosen rather than one that simply feels safest in the moment. Here's a practical way to start applying this without needing one enormous life-altering leap right away. Identify one specific thing you've been postponing, not because you're genuinely unprepared for it, but because it makes you uncomfortable to attempt. Be honest about which category it actually falls into, since postponing something you're genuinely unprepared for is simply wisdom, while postponing something purely out of discomfort is the pattern actually worth interrupting. Once you've identified it, ask what the smallest possible version of that step would look like, small enough that skipping it would feel more effortful than simply doing it. Not the full leap, the smallest available piece of it that still counts as genuine forward motion rather than more planning disguised as progress. It's worth being specific about what smallest possible version actually means in practice, because people often underestimate how small it can genuinely be while still counting. If the eventual goal is starting a business, the smallest version this week might simply be having one honest conversation with someone who's already done it, not launching a product. If the eventual goal is a difficult conversation with someone important to you, the smallest version might simply be writing down honestly what you'd actually want to say before you've committed to saying it out loud yet. The smallest version exists to build momentum and gather real information, not to complete the entire journey in a single step. Take that smallest version this week and then afterward do an honest accounting, not of whether it succeeded in some external sense, but of whether you actually survived the discomfort and what you learned by being on the other side of it. That accounting, repeated across a series of small steps, is what actually builds the kind of durable courage that eventually makes the larger steps considerably more approachable than they would have been otherwise. After several weeks of this pattern, you'll likely notice something worth paying attention to. The specific category of discomfort you've been practicing against starts to feel measurably less overwhelming than it did at the start, not because the underlying stakes have changed, but because you've built direct, repeated evidence that you can survive stepping into it. That evidence is genuinely transferable. Courage built through small, deliberate practice in one area tends to make courage in adjacent areas somewhat more accessible too, since the underlying skill being built was never really domain-specific in the first place. It was always the more general skill of acting despite discomfort, which applies considerably more broadly than whatever specific context you happen to practice it in first. One last thing worth sitting with before we close. Years from now, looking back, the specific moments that end up mattering most rarely look, from the outside, like dramatic turning points while they're actually happening. They tend to look, in the moment, like an ordinary Tuesday where you did the slightly uncomfortable thing instead of the comfortable one, for no particularly dramatic reason beyond having decided quietly that it mattered enough to do anyway. There's a reason this pattern holds true so consistently, worth naming directly before we finish. Dramatic, obviously significant moments are rare, and waiting specifically for one to demonstrate courage means waiting for something that might genuinely never arrive in the recognizable form you're picturing. Ordinary, unremarkable moments, by contrast, arrive constantly, dozens of times a week, each one a small, low-stakes opportunity to practice the exact same underlying skill that the dramatic moment would have required anyway. The person who's been practicing on the ordinary moments all along tends to be considerably better prepared for the rare dramatic one, if and when it eventually shows up, than the person who saved all their courage for an occasion that may or may not ever actually arrive in a form they'd recognize. That specific kind of ordinary Tuesday is available to you again tomorrow, exactly as available as it was today, containing exactly the same choice it always contains, between the comfortable option and the one that actually moves you somewhere. Not eventually, not once conditions finally feel perfect. Tomorrow, in whatever small, unglamorous form that choice happens to take. That's genuinely where every version of the life you're describing, when you imagine your future, actually begins. If nothing else from the last 30 minutes sticks with you, let it be this. You were never actually being asked to become fearless. Nobody genuinely accomplished in any field ever fully stopped feeling fear before acting. What separated them was simpler and considerably more available to you right now than fearlessness ever was. They kept moving anyway on the ordinary days as much as the dramatic ones, one prepared, imperfect step at a time.